You know that feeling when you're Paul McCartney and it's the 80s? Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. It's that old mullet-stricken, glory years are over, universally panned movie malaise we've all experienced.
This movie is a real disgrace. I give it 1 star.
And you can't even reform the Beatles to cheer yourself up because the hologram tech just ain't there yet. But what if the impossible were to occur? The chance to make a record as the Beatles again. All 4 of you, the ones who are dead and the ones who don't like you. How could this incredible scenario come about? Keep watching to find out. The former Beatles spent most of the 70s estranged. Outside the warm embrace of collective identity, they each soon felt a new, chilling sensation. Irrelevance. As the decade wore on, McCartney turned from cool to cuddly, while the rest of them quickly turned into has-beens. Squabbles flew in all directions. John was angry at Paul for buying shares in their song catalogue behind his back. Paul was angry at John for slandering him on record.
How do you sleep, you cunt?
George was angry at John for never repaying his loyalties, and angry at Paul, saying his condescending attitude ruined him as a guitar player. John was angry at George for disrespecting Yoko. George sued Ringo for recording a crap version of a song he'd written, and Yoko disliked everyone except John. She encouraged his year zero past his dead mentality and would screen calls from the former Beatles, his first wife and his first son. Of course, there were good days and brighter moments mixed in. George played on John's early solo material, and all of them contributed songs and performances to Ringo's 1973 album, the only time all 4 Beatles appeared on the same album following the split. During an 18-month estrangement from Yoko, Lennon's attitude softened. He began seeing old friends again, and he was on the brink of attending a Wings recording session, possibly with a view to contributing when Ono resumed contact and he suddenly backed out. When Lennon was murdered in 1980, this did not lead to a thawing in relations. When the Lennon-McCartney catalogue went on sale a few years later, Paul actually contacted Yoko to ask her to form a joint bid with him, but she delayed, and in the interim, Michael Jackson bought them instead. This especially stung McCartney because it was him who taught Jackson about the value of song copyrights in the first place. Ringo and Paul did appear on George's tribute to John, and Ringo co-starred in Paul's crap film.
Ready to do one?
But in 1988, when the Beatles were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, McCartney refused to attend due to ongoing legal battles, saying, "I would feel like a complete hypocrite waving and smiling with them." Despite all this, it was Paul, the eternal pop star, who was keeping the Beatles' spirit alive, and out of all of them, who would most want a return to the glory years. George's own appearance at the induction had been a minor miracle, given that he was now dismissive of the Beatles and the spotlight generally. Ringo hadn't recorded in years and spent most of the decade drunkenly narrating Thomas the Tank Engine.
"Well, Thomas," he said, "I've heard all about it and I'm very pleased with you. You're a really useful engine."
But Paul never stopped. He tried new songwriting collaborations, people like 10cc's Eric Stewart and Elvis Costello, and they did some good work, but nobody could ever live up to John Lennon, and no record under his own name could ever match the excitement of the Beatles. The year after the ceremony, he dug his violin bass out of retirement and began doing what he's done ever since, touring the world, playing Beatles songs. When the chance came to make the impossible come true, McCartney, above all of them, was determined to make it happen. Talk of an official documentary on the Beatles' career had been in the air since they split, and in fact a 90-minute feature called The Long and Winding Road had been assembled in 1971, but never shown. By 1980, the plan had morphed into a TV special with an epic finale planned. Ono would later say, just days before his brutal murder, John was making plans to go to England for a triumphant Beatles reunion. This would have included a reunion concert to be filmed for the special, Ono adding, John felt they had travelled separate paths for long enough and were now mature enough to try writing and recording new songs. It was only Lennon's forced participation in the worst piece of J.D. Salinger fanfiction ever that would rob us of the fruits of that project. It would be over a decade before the documentary was revived. Meanwhile, the 80s were not kind to poor George and Ringo. From 1977 onwards, the latter's albums barely sold. George had some scattered chart success, but was reduced to taking orders from his label, who would reject songs. He went into film production and had some initial success, and his company Handmade had credits including The Life of Brian and With Nail and I. Unfortunately, that all went south after a series of flops, when Harrison discovered that his business partner had put him personally on the hook for all the company's debts. Handmade closed in 1991, with Harrison on the brink of bankruptcy. This was how, having previously shown no interest in the idea, Harrison suddenly found himself with a pressing need to co-star in an 8-part documentary series with tie-in book and 3-part double album set. Luckily, all the Beatles' legal battles had resolved by now, and relations had thawed. Ringo's participation was never in any doubt. He would have just been glad to see old friends and do something that mattered again. Paul was suddenly several steps closer to his dream scenario, reviving the Beatles. He steered them towards talk of new music, something for the show maybe, but nobody wanted to do anything without John. It's not known who first had the idea of maybe trying to work with an old tape of Lennon's, but things had evidently thawed enough with Yoko that an approach was made. Did she, by any chance, have any spare tapes of Lennon lying around? John Lennon spent the latter half of the 70s effectively retired. He wasn't exactly proud of his old 60s absentee dad shtick and was determined not to repeat the mistakes with his new son by Yoko. He didn't stop entirely though, and by the end of the decade had amassed rough demos of a couple of dozen tunes. In 1994, Yoko responded to the Beatles with a tape of 4 songs: Real Love, Grow Old With Me, Now and Then, and Free as a Bird. These were not studio-quality demos, just home cassettes recorded on a tiny portable tape player. They were songs already known to Lennon fans through bootlegs, but none had ever been completed in the studio. Among the Beatles, Free as a Bird was the favourite, a ballad with a yearning, mournful mood to it and good chords, arguably better than a lot of what Lennon had released during his solo years. And it was close to finished, but with enough gaps that the Threetles had something to do besides play along. There were a few moments where the chords sounded underdeveloped. The demo had an odd descending pattern at the end of each verse cycle. Also, he hadn't worked out a good ending to the bridge, which ended on the same chord the verse began with. In both cases, the solution was the same, substituting a more sunny, classic-sounding change to the E chord. But they saved John's original idea for the end of the second verse. After you've heard their version for most of the song, it works as a great twist, Lennon subverting their chord change from beyond the grave. It's a beautiful thing that they were able to create this moment of genuine Lennon-McCartney push-pull in the song. Best of all were a few bars where Lennon didn't have words. This provided a perfect opening for Paul and George to write a few lines. Paul later said that was really like working on a record with John, as Lennon, McCartney and Harrison. George and I were vying for the best lyric. I don't think these lines get enough attention or praise. Some people criticise them for being too on the nose, maybe without realising exactly what a rare lifting of the veil is happening here. Because by this point, the Beatles were very corporate in their communication. They always presented a glossed-over narrative, instinctively downplaying everything about the band, good or bad. To get this kind of heartfelt commentary from them about the Beatles and themselves was by then unheard of. In these lines, they acknowledge the sadness of the band being over, the depth of their bonds to each other, the power of what they did together, and how great it made them feel when it was happening. You wouldn't get them admitting to any of that with that depth of sincerity in any other context, and if pressed, they probably wouldn't even admit to doing it here. They'd just say you were reading too much into it. The space these lines gave McCartney and Harrison to sing lead was also ideal conceptually. In the past, they'd all get a turn singing a track on an album. It was perfect that this was reproduced on their comeback song and they all got a turn to sing. Apart from Ringo, obviously, but you have to draw a line somewhere. This leads us to a less heartwarming aspect of the project. Paul takes the first bridge and George takes the second, which is half the length. The old band hierarchies are being maintained. Despite his money worries, Harrison didn't come to the project without conditions. He still held grudges about being talked down to in the Beatles years and refused to work with George Martin again. A long negotiation took place. George insisted on his travelling Wilburys mate Jeff Lynne as the producer. Paul insisted they use their old engineer Jeff Emmerich. George vetoed The Long and Winding Road as a documentary title for being too McCartney-centric, and McCartney insisted they record at his home studio. Though to be fair, there was probably no argument on that last one. If they'd all been seen entering Abbey Road together, they wouldn't have got a moment's peace. Before they could start recording, Lynne had some pre-production to do, the main one being fixing Lennon's tempo, which tended to wander a lot. He had to take the tape and synchronise it to a click so it could be played to, and apparently the way this was done was by chopping up the recording and dropping each line manually. McCartney said that afterwards there were little gaps where he'd sped up or gone out a bit. This suggests that time stretch technology wasn't used, although it did exist at the time. The biggest problem, though, was that they had no independent control over Lennon's vocal and piano in the mix. The two were a single sound source and could no more be separated than you could remove the egg from a cake. To offset this, Paul actually double-tracked Lennon's vocal, trying his best to match his timbre and phrasing. He essentially did the most exact impersonation he could of a casual 15-year-old home recording left behind by his dead friend. Lennon's absence obviously hung heavily over the whole project and was overwhelming at times, inspiring Paul to invent the fiction that he was merely on holiday and had left them a song to finish. Ringo especially found this helpful, although George's feelings about it aren't known. Then there was the question of arrangement. Paul has said that he originally heard the song as a big orchestral 40s Gershwin thing. A slight contradiction in terms as Gershwin died in 1937, but it seems McCartney was probably thinking in the ballpark of things like Honey Pie, Good Night and other previous retro experiments.
Oh, honey pie.
Eventually, as we know, they played it straight, with Paul trying to avoid anything showy and insisting George do the same. This led to some tension when Jeff Lynne suggested George add some slide guitar, because it's interesting to note that Harrison, for all that he's known as a slide player, never actually did that on a Beatles record. Paul McCartney objected to the idea, saying, it's George's trademark, it'll be My Sweet Lord all over again. Lynne suggested a compromise, keep it bluesy and avoid anything too melodic. McCartney was satisfied with this, saying, I think he plays a blinder. Then it was time for harmonies, and this was the apex for Paul. The point where, finally, just for a few moments, his old wish came true. He later said about it, fuck, I'm singing harmony with John. It's like an impossible dream. Everyone was excited by the final result. Ringo said it was a mind-blower. It sounds like the bloody Beatles. George said, I hope someone does this to all my crap demos when I'm dead, making them into hit songs. And Paul said, we've done the impossible. He was in the studio. It was good being them again for a little while. So this video is part of a series called And I'm Growing Old, where I discuss the work of ageing artists. And for a bit of fun, I like to just score the songs on a few different aspects. Firstly, personnel. How many members of the classic lineup are on it? And I'm going to score them 90%. I'm docking them 10 for the fact that Lennon was ported in from a different era of history. Next, freshness. And I'm going to say medium. The Beatles always tried to do something new, and to be fair, working with a dodgy old cassette after one of them had died was definitely a first. And also, I don't think there'd ever been a Beatles song before where all three of the main vocalists took a solo lead. But the fact is, musically, it pushes no boundaries, and in fact they made a special effort not to do that, which is a very un-Beatles approach to making a record. Next, self-sufficiency. 100%. No outside writers or performers were needed to push this thing over the finish line. Jeff Lynne apparently did get to have a turn on backing vocals, but they didn't need that to happen, so we'll turn a blind eye. Next, integrity. A mixed bag. Ringo's motivation was probably the purest, having the least complicated relationship with the band. Paul brought a genuine, undimmed love of the Beatles, but he also had a more self-interested motivation to remind everyone who he was and put himself back on top. For George, although he obviously loved John and there were probably moments that were moving for him, the fact is for him this was a cash grab. Cringe factor. Medium. It is a great song and it's moving, but the result does have a bit of a plodding, stiff-jointed feel to it. I think it's a shame Paul's Gershwin idea wasn't pursued. A bit of swing could have lifted it. And also, if they did that old-timey honey pie kind of approach, they could have added some crackle. They could have lent into the lo-fi aspects of it rather than needing to disguise them. Why wasn't I consulted? I think the song's acronym sums it up nicely. They used to be fab, but now they're a slightly distended, off version of that. Also, I could have done without Paul's farty, dad rock bass sound. But having said that, MVP, Paul McCartney. Out of all the surviving members, he was the one that brought the real dedication and passion, who put all those mad hours in. Thanks for watching. What do you all think? Is Free as a Bird a real Beatles song? Is it great? Does it suck? Let us know in the comments. As you all know, there's more to this story. Click here to find out what George Martin thought of Free as a Bird and to learn about the making of its follow-up, Real Love. If you've enjoyed this content, please do click here to subscribe to the channel. I'm trying to reach 1,000 subscribers this year. Stay jolly. I'll see you next time.